We good, Christian? Oh, yes, we are. Holy man. These are the best seats. The ones on the wings here, a little ways away, but look at them. This is awesome. I love everything about this. Hi, I'm Richard Campbell. I have been in Copenhagen before, but not in this venue. This is a really cool venue. I know I sound like an American, but I'm actually Canadian. This is my house on the left. The place on the right is my neighbor's house. We call this the Animal Highway. This is a Wednesday morning in my town. Wednesday morning is garbage day. So until I put this camera in, I didn't know that every Wednesday morning, the bear comes to see if I put out my garbage early. And I don't, because he makes a big mess if I do. But yeah, they stroll through all the time. It's weird to be used to the fact that, yeah, we have bears visit at least weekly. But we have a forest in behind us. He's going to cut across the cul-de-sac through the neighbor's house and then down to the next ravine. It's just a big buffet for him. They're fairly easy to live with. I do recommend it. And by the way, I put this back in just for Christian, who's the audio engineer, who's been taking care of me for the past couple of days. He's the best, and he liked the bear shot. I make a lot of podcasts. Any .NET Rocks listeners? Oh, yeah, a few in the room. So my friend Carl Franklin started .NET Rocks back in 2002, which is before the word podcast existed. And I came on board as the co-host in 2004. We've made 1,850 episodes so far, put them out every week. Talking with clever people about .NET and stuff that .NET developers need to know. I also make shows for sysadmins, and for a little while there, we needed a dedicated show for tablets, but we eventually rolled that back into .NET Rocks. For a while on .NET Rocks, once a month, I would do a Geek Out episode. I'm interested in all kinds of things, and the Geek Outs were an opportunity for me to sort of consolidate my thinking about stuff, like how can I really narrow down into space topics, things like that. And Carl talked me into us actually making a show around it. And so we've made about 100 of them now out of that 1,800 or so shows. And the original version of this particular talk comes from the Moon-based Geek Out, which we did back in 2017. I'd been reading some papers from the European Space Agency, and they were talking very seriously about establishing a laboratory on the south pole of the moon, very much like Antarctic laboratories, that would be occasionally manned to do experimentation. They had a list of the kind of experiments they want to do, and they're like, this is cool. Put together all the notes and managed to put an hour together to talk about, very seriously back in 2017, what it would take to build a base on the moon, why we might want to do that, and so on. And it was popular, got around. In fact, one day I got a call from NASA, which is a pretty good day. Now, let's be clear. First, they sent me email. You get an email from nasa.gov, and you're like, yeah, right, and you delete it. And then they sent it again, and it's like, well, this guy's pretty persistent. Turns out he actually was from NASA. And it's like, hey, we really like your moon-based podcast. I'm like, thanks. That's cool. Would you ever do a talk about it? And I remember he only knows I'm a podcaster. He has no idea of what I do in the rest of my life. Yeah, I could probably put a talk together on that. I'm like, do you like PowerPoint? We really like PowerPoint at NASA. I'm like, yeah, Chuck, I like PowerPoint. He goes, well, would you come and talk to us about the moon? I'm like, talk to you? Yeah. You know it's your stuff, right? Like, I read your stuff. He goes, yeah, we like the way you say it. I'm like, okay. So later in that same year, I went down to the Ames Research Center, which is a NASA facility south of San Francisco, and I got to talk to a group of real space scientists and engineers, including folks who'd flown stuff to the moon, about building bases on the moon. And I was intimidated. Now, the guy who freaked me out the most in the room was a guy named Ron Andrews. And Ron Andrews is an engineer, and he helped construct the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. So this is a guy who he did the L-Cross mission. The L-Cross mission was the mission that used, part of the LRO flight, they used the second stage of the Atlas booster as an impactor to prove that there was water ice on the moon. So this was the guy who led that project. He wasn't the science side, this was the engineering side. He figured out how to precisely land a school bus-sized object in a continuously shaded portion of a crater with vigor as he described it, which is a way of it hit really hard, enough to kick up a plume so large that the sensor pack that was about an hour behind it, had been released a couple of days before, was able to do spectral analysis of that plume. Just go, there's water ice, bam! And it worked. That guy was in the room. That's a heck of a guy. So I mentioned every single one of his projects during the talk and how great they all were. When we talk about spaceflight today, I kind of want to start in 2011 with the last shuttle flight. This was STS-135, the Atlantis orbiter, the end of an era, 30 years and 135 missions, two vehicles lost and 17 lives. But it was a problematic machine. It's also why we started doing the Geek Outs back in the day. At the end of this flight, I was ranting at Carl about all the problems the shuttle represented, how difficult a machine it was, how it never achieved its goals, while still being extraordinary. And that got us into this idea of making Geek Outs. And it hits me really hard as someone who grew up during the space shuttle flights to see this vehicle that flew 35 times into space is now a museum piece. And if you ever get a chance to go to Florida, not that I think it's a great time to go to Florida, and go to the Kennedy Space Center, there's a beautiful tour where they talk about developing the shuttles, and it ends magnificently with this wall coming up, and you have a view of Atlantis in front of you, and it makes me emotional every time. But that is very much the past. With spacecraft being retired like that. We have more modern spacecraft, arguably less sexy. You may not even recognize this particular rocket. This is the COTS Demo Flight 1. This is the old SpaceX Falcon 9. This was the first test in 2010, just before the last Atlantis flight, to the second flight ever of a Falcon 9, to go up to the space station to do commercial resupply. That's what COTS was about, was we pay by the kilo to supply stuff to the space station. How you get it there, your problem. Normally, NASA pays for everything and you build to the specifications. But in this case, they're just saying, we want X many kilos up and X many kilos down. This is what we're willing to pay. And this was a commercial business. And this is a pretty basic, if very well-tuned rocket. It's powered by kerosene, RP1, which is a refined form of jet fuel, combined with liquid oxygen to provide propellant. And that's what makes this rocket run, and it's very common. That particular version is the original Falcon 9 design. It was only the first flight, the V1, so it is substantially smaller than the Falcon 9s that have come since. Now, there's been hundreds and hundreds of Falcon 9s since then. The latest variation, which is considered, they call the full thrust variant, or the Block 5 variant, that's the version that can land its first stage back on the ground. And they've done 200 of those and landed over 100 of them, or 150 now. And it's been doing commercial resupply. It's also now doing crew supply. So it brings crews. Crew 7 just went up, the 7th flight to bring crew members to the space station, again, in a very commercially financed way. So they reduce costs, efficiency, and at this point, SpaceX flies more tonnage into low Earth orbit than the rest of the world combined. And there's a price that's concerning. I don't know if you've seen the guy in charge of that place, but he's a little nutty. And he's got the most cost-effective rocket in the world. And so it's transforming Space Force, for better or worse. By the way, the Americans did decide they didn't want to be dependent on one rocket to bring the crew up, so they paid a lot of money to have Boeing also build a crew capsule, a ship called Starliner. You haven't heard much about it because it doesn't work. They spent more, both projects were started about the same time, in 2010. They started on the project to build crewed spacecraft, and Starliner's gone through many iterations. The last time it was on the pad was in 2022. It flew its second test unmanned flight and went so poorly they want to fly it that again. But they found more problems since then, and now they're talking about first flights probably not until March of next year. First time it could possibly lift crew is in 2025. It's not easy to build these vehicles, and part of the challenge is that a lot of the old space companies like Boeing and United Launch Alliance and so forth, have lived their entire industry in what's called a cost-plus model. So NASA basically says, build it to our specifications, we will pay all costs, and if you make these deadlines, we'll pay you bonuses. And so you really have no incentive to get better, because as long as you work every time, they'll pay whatever it costs, as opposed to the commercial model, which says we will pay this much per kilo into space, figure it out. Now, that's got its own challenges. When you're doing unique space flights, there is no model to go after, and so it's hard to do a commercial. But when you're doing routine space flights, like into low Earth orbit, it does make sense to commercialize it, and it substantially reduces costs. And so the old companies are having a tough time switching models. The Atlas V rocket, which is actually the one that supposed to lift Starliner and is now being phased out, has had over 150 flights, all of which have been successful, but at a very high price because they use those cost-plus pricing models. This is also an RP-1 LOX rocket. The only real strike against the Atlas V, besides being a 30-year-old design, is that it uses Russian rocket engines, the RD-180, and that is not appropriate in America these days. There's a replacement rocket coming, and that rocket is called Vulcan. And I'm using a mock-up picture of it because it hasn't flown yet. Now, so Vulcan is basically the update of Atlas V with a few new features. They're using American engines made by Blue Origin, an engine called the BE-4. They are at the point now where they are doing testing of the first stage. So they've done a couple of tests. Unfortunately, with the test in March of their upper stage resulted in that stage exploding on the ground. Not a feature you're looking for, so they're barely compensating for that. The difference in this rocket is that it's not an RP-1 liquid oxygen rocket, it's a methane liquid oxygen rocket. Methane's become a very hip fuel. The main advantage with methane is that it's actually got, it's cryogenically cooled very much the same way as liquid oxygen, so it behaves like liquid oxygen in a lot of respects. It is more energetically efficient than RP-1, so it provides a higher ISP than RP-1 for a little less density. You need your fuel tank to be about twice the size than it would be for an RP-1 tank. So your tanks end up being bigger, but you do the same kind of fuel handling. There's some pressurization tricks you can do. It has substantial benefits. The first Vulcan flight, which was supposed to be in July and has now been pushed to the end of 2023, probably slip into 2024, is going to have a lander on it. This is the Astrobotic Peregrine lander. This thing is fully built. It was originally announced in 2016. It's supposed to land on the moon. That's about a 1.2 ton lander, roughly 2 meters high. It won't be a long-lived explorer on the moon. We have other explorers on the moon right now. This will last maybe a month or so. But it's cool that their first flight's going to have a payload on it that goes directly to the moon. It says a lot about how hip and excited they are about the Vulcan rocket. The BE-4 engine is this very important engine. It's obviously going to help. It helps with the Vulcan rocket. Engines are very much fitted to their spacecraft. It's not simple to get this thing right. They spent a long time in gestation. It was supposed to be ready for flight by 2017. They got their first real production articles together in 2021. There's a pair now on the first Vulcan rocket. Unfortunately, in June this year, they had a second pair for the second Vulcan flight, and in acceptance testing, one of them exploded. There's a lot of explosions in space. The other thing that this rocket's supposed to do is this engine's supposed to do is power a new rocket called New Glenn. Now, the company is Blue Origin. They make the engine, and they're also proposing this gigantic rocket. This is a 7-meter rocket. This is the company owned by Jeff Bezos. Billionaires in space. He has a much smaller rocket called New Shepard, which is a suborbital class rocket, but this is supposed to be an orbital class rocket, and it's massive. It's hard to, I hope you could spend some time over at Copenhagen suborbital and see their sounding rocket, which is super cool and very reasonable size. It's still a pretty big machine. The Falcon 9, this incredibly reliable, consistent, repeatedly flown into space, most potent rocket on the planet right now, it's a 3.7 meter rocket. Why is it 3.7 meters wide? Because that fits on American highways. So Elon wanted to build his rockets in Hawthorne, California, but he had to deliver them to Florida. If he made them any bigger, he was going to have to take them by ship through the Panama Canal to do that. So he made them the largest size he could fit that would still sit on a truck to be able to be trucked across. And that makes it a relatively narrow rocket. There are rules in rocketry about your height to your width. They call it the fineness ratio. And you don't want to be much above 15 to 1 in a fineness ratio. If you're taller than that, you start to have what they call angular moments, or your rocket starts bending. not a feature we look for in rockets. And in the Falcon 9 is not 15 to 1. The Falcon 9 is 18 to 1. So they have stretched that rocket to its absolute limits to make it do what it's going to do. It's kind of tapped out. They can't do much more with it. The payload fairing's about as big as it can get. It's as tall as it can get. They need a wider rocket. And that's the idea behind New Glenn. 7 meters wide, running 7 of the BE-4s. That's a lot of power and a lot of room. It'll make it one of the largest rockets ever made. Whenever it flies, because unlike SpaceX, which tends to do all their rocketry development in public and with great YouTube videos, New Glenn and Blue Origin are very secretive. Now, we have seen them moving some components around lately, so we believe there's a rocket coming there. We just haven't seen it. NASA just committed to a mission in 2024 to fly a payload to Mars on one of the first New Glenn flights. That's literally next year. I think they're very optimistic, but the nature of Mars, flying to Mars, is there are very narrow flight windows when you can make it, and it's a 2-week window in August next year. So if they're not ready then, they probably won't fly for another 2 years. Then we have NASA's own rocket, a rocket called the Space Launch System, SLS. This is actually a photograph of Artemis 1, the first SLS flight. Now, if these rocket parts look similar to Space Shuttle, there's a reason they're recycled Space Shuttle parts, or remade Space Shuttle parts. Now we get into the politics of space flight. One of the things that NASA did a great job of around the Space Shuttle especially is that every single state in the United States, all 50 of them, contributed to the Space Shuttle, which meant that you had a politician in every state that wanted that rocket, that craft to keep flying. But when Shuttle finally hit its limits, when after the Columbia disaster and the completion of the space station, they really couldn't fly Shuttle anymore, the answer was use the same parts, same design, because it'll save money. But it'll also keep all those people employed in all of those states to make this rocket. Now, the Space Shuttle itself weighed 100 tons. And so, in theory, if you got rid of the shuttle but used all the same rocket parts, that's 100 tons of lift, and that's a lot. You know, a typical Falcon 9 can lift about 20 tons, and usually it lifts about 15. So a 100-ton lift is a lot. It's the kind of thing you'd fly to the moon with, which is exactly what they've been doing with it. So one of the reasons it's so massive is that its bottom stage, its first stage, is liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen powered. And liquid hydrogen is a very efficient fuel. It provides the highest levels of ISP, but it's very low density. A liquid hydrogen tank, to provide the same amount of total performance as an RP1 tank, is 8 times larger. You just can't pack hydrogen down too small. It's also a very difficult fuel to work with. It has to be kept much colder than liquid oxygen. In fact, it's so cold that if liquid oxygen comes anywhere near it, the oxygen freezes solid. So they have to provide insulation between the two tanks to keep the liquid hydrogen from freezing the liquid oxygen. Also, the boiling range of liquid hydrogen is only between frozen solid and boiling off is about 7 degrees. You know, we manage water with a 100-degree temperature range. And we have lots of room in there to keep it steady and liquid. You can't do that with liquid hydrogen. So hydrogen is an incredibly difficult fuel to work with. And it's part of the reason this rocket has been stunningly expensive. $2 to $4 billion a flight, US dollars, where SpaceX flights are now around $20 million. So it's just not even in the same league. This is the initial version of the SLS. There are several larger proposed versions, making the boosters larger, adding more engines, increasing the upper stage performance, and all with an eye ultimately to supplying to the moon. One last rocket to talk about. It's the other SpaceX rocket, the rocket they call Starship. This is a 9-meter rocket. That's really very big. But what Elon's shooting for with this rocket is 100% reuse. So the first stage will do 2.5 minutes flight to get the second stage up far enough to make it to orbit, and then it'll turn around, fly back, and land back on the pad the same way a Falcon 9 does, except much more massive, 33 Raptor engines on it. Unbelievably huge. But even crazier is the upper stage, being able to get into orbit, do its work, turn around and re-enter the atmosphere and land on its tail. It's something out of Buck Rogers. But parts of it have already been demonstrated. And if you've been watching the YouTube videos and things, you've seen them land an upper stage as a demonstration. They only flew it up to 10,000 meters and brought it back down again, so no re-entry speeds. But they did make a rocket fall on its belly, then turn on its tail and land once. Recently, there was a test on April 20th, because Elon has a fixation with 420. The first attempt to fly a heavy booster, it had problems. I don't know why he did this flight. It doesn't make a lot of sense. The design he flew was out of date. 3 of the engines failed at liftoff. 4 should have been a cancellation. But the side effect of 3 of the engines failing is that the liftoff speed was very low. It spent much more time on the pad as it was climbing out, which was bad. We got great video of it flying. You can see at this point, so many engines are already out. It was cooking off its hydraulic controls. There was various bits of fire and flame and bits flying off. But boy, oh boy, it was a show, and it ended in a big pile of debris. Now, that's fine. He didn't expect the rocket to complete its entire flight. There's data to be learned. You're testing in public, and that's good. And they have another rocket ready to go with newer technology on it already. They're ready to fly. But they only had one pad. And that pad had a bad day. In fact, it's such a bad day, there's still a serious FAA investigation going on about it. This, over 150 acres of land was damaged by this. There were meter-deep craters left by concrete being blown over several kilometers around. 2 hectares burned in a protected area. It's a lot of damage. And while they've repaired it and put in a water deluge system, so this is just a couple of weeks ago, they did this test. So that's a new booster, rebuilt landing pad, but now they have a big sprinkler head on the ground below it that sprays high-pressure water upward to decrease the impact of the engines firing, hopefully not destroying the pad the next time they try and fly it. So they're apparently basically ready to go for the next flight. Elon's saying as much. But the FAA has not authorized them to fly, and arguably the environmental investigation for the damage caused by blowing that pad up in April isn't done. Now, we haven't heard a lot from the FAA about this. The one sticking point I'd have that Elon might get a pass is that SpaceX also won the contract for the Lunar lander for the Artemis missions. And so this is the platform that will test that lunar lander, and if the FAA delays it, they're delaying the lunar landings. And now you have all those folks in Congress that are interested in not delaying that stuff because it means Artemis can't fly. So there's a political play there for taking ridiculous risks. Just a reminder just how big a Starship is. So there's the shuttle, all the way down. It was never a particular tall rocket. By the way, strapping your spacecraft to the side of your rocket, bad idea. Don't do that. They've only done it once. They're not going to do it anymore. That's what killed Columbia, arguably was part of the problem with Challenger. There are no abort modes when you're set up that way, ways to get out when things go wrong. The Falcon Heavy, so that is a Falcon 9. If you see the scale of that, SLS is that much bigger. The original from the 1960s rocket that went to the moon, the Saturn V, was the largest. That bottom stage on the Saturn V, stage 1, is a 10 meter, so slightly bigger than Starship, although Starship is 9 meters all the way up. And Starship, again, represents a very profound rocket. If it does as advertised, it should substantially change the industry, much as Falcon 9 already has. So here's the only table in this whole story. It's this one here, just sort of breaking down the prices. I mentioned the Atlas V at the top. It's kind of the oldest rocket. It's from the 90s. Originally, price per kilo to low Earth orbit was about $25,000. They reduced that price in later years, mostly because Falcon 9 was eating their lunch. They got down to about $8,000 a kilo. Falcon 9 at $3,500 a kilo. That's with inflation. It's the cheapest flight in town. In theory, a heavy is cheaper, but only if it's carrying full weight, that 54 metric tons, which it has never done, and nobody needs that payload. And realistically, a 50-ton spacecraft won't fit in the fairing. So it probably never will fly that full payload. So that number's a little unfair. The rest of these numbers are fiction. Falcon is yet to fly. We don't actually know what it left. That's the number that ULA presents to us. New Glenn, we haven't even seen, so we don't really know either. The Space Launch System, okay, we've had Artemis fly once. Yes, it was a $4 billion rocket, so that's a good approximation of what it actually costs, and you get an idea of how expensive spaceflight can be when there are no cost controls in place, which is essentially what's going on with Artemis. The current guess for Starship, if it's a fully reusable, refurbishable rocket, depending on who you ask, is somewhere between $10,000 and $1,000 a kilo. If it's down in the triple digits, you're now talking a flight into orbit for the price of a first-class ticket across the Atlantic. It's a profound change if it comes true. Falcon 9 has already changed the business, no two ways about it. But there could be much more, and it's not that far away. If the testing continues and he stops blowing up his pad, we might actually get there. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. The rocket's made of stainless steel. It's literally something out of Buck Rogers. He switched from carbon fiber to stainless steel because stainless steel actually gets stronger at cryogenic temperatures. And that additional simplicity in structure offsets its additional weight. It's all great experimentation. We've just got to actually deliver the machine. The question is what to do with it. Like, we're not thinking a lot about stuff we could really do in space with the price decreases that we're currently faced with. So let's talk about some of that stuff. Now, I'm going to talk about the moon. This is my favorite picture of the moon. Now, rule number one in our CGI world, whenever you see an image like this, is to say, who took this picture? Because this is a very funny picture. You're looking at the far side of the moon. It's not the dark side of the moon. As you can see, it's very well lit at this particular point, although it is actually darker than the near side of the moon. The moon is tidally locked to the Earth. So the same side of the moon always faces the Earth, and the far side of the moon never sees the Earth, which creates its own set of problems. Now, who took this picture? A satellite took this picture. The Discovery satellite. It is a solar observation satellite. It sits 1.5 million kilometers away from Earth in a stationary orbit between the Earth and the Sun. It's relatively close to the Sun. It's 1.5 million kilometers from here. It observes the Sun to give us information about what's up with the Sun. Sometimes we have solar storms that can impact the Earth, and early warning is useful. And it has a telescope on the back of it that took this photograph. And to be clear, it's a telescope. It was taking a picture of the Earth 1.5 million kilometers away. Here's the subtle thing about it. It's a monochromatic camera. So the way they take a color photo is that they actually rotate a filter in front of the camera, and they take 4 pictures. And normally it always takes a full frame picture of the Earth, which is cool. You get these full frame routine photos of the Earth because it's always facing the Sun that way. But every so often, the moon whizzes through the frame. And this is one of those times. And whizzes is the real thing. And if you get up close to this picture, you'll notice that on the leading edge of the moon, there's a green halo. And the green halo is there because green is the 4th filter they used to take the pictures, and by the time the 4th picture was taken, the moon had moved. And so the color alignment's just a little bit out. The kind of thing a CGI guy wouldn't do. But it's a real picture. All right. We've been to the moon. Well, the Americans have been to the moon. They've called the Apollo missions. They were military missions. Even though they called it all about the science, there are 12 humans that walked on the moon. They are all white men. 11 of them were military test pilots. Military mission. They were trying to beat the Soviets. Rather than have a war, let's race to the moon, and the Americans won. The one that's not the military test pilot is in the bottom right corner. That's Jack Schmitt. Jack Schmitt is a geologist. And he was supposed to be on Apollo 18, but they canceled Apollo 18. The moment Apollo 11 landed on the moon, they wanted to cancel it. Now that we've won, don't mess it up. Every mission after this is risky as heck, and if we kill people on the moon, we're going to screw up our win. And so as they started canceling missions, and they canceled the one mission that had a scientist on it, went, listen, you got to move him. So he got to go on Apollo 17, and he's the only scientist that ever set foot on the moon. And if you ever watch any of the footage from it, you'll recognize that there's a scientist on the moon. This is a picture of Jack. Jack's on the moon, and Jack's a geologist. And you'll notice that Jack is dirty because geologists are into rocks. really into rocks. And he got low down looking at the rocks. He would also keep lifting up his visor. There's a gold shield visor in front of him to protect his eyes because you've got no atmosphere to filter the sun, and it will burn out your retinas. But it also changes the color of the rocks. And Jack likes rocks, so he keeps flipping up his visor. In fact, he's the only picture with a visible face on the moon because he was willing to endanger his eyes to look at rocks. And if you look closer at this picture, you'll notice that on the right side of his helmet, there's little squares. So on your left arm in the Apollo suit, there is the schedule, the step-by-step steps of what you're going to do for every minute of every day that you're on the moon. They planned it all. As you finish it, you flip the page. Well, Jack wanted to look at rocks. So he started ripping off the finished pages and stuffing it in the side of his helmet so that he could flip up his visor and look at the rocks. And he arguably found the most important rocks on the moon because he's actually a scientist. And the real science is not done with Eureka, I found it. It's done with, what the heck is that? You have to know enough about rocks to know that's a weird rock. We should look at that rock. But he's our only proof point that when you take scientifically interested humans and put them in a new environment, they explore. They really explore. They jeopardize their lives to explore. I'm not saying the other 11 men weren't extraordinary, but when you ask the other 11 men, what were you thinking about while you were on the moon? They said, please God, don't let me screw up. Because they're test pilots, and test pilots follow the script. Scientists explore, and we've only had one. And we found so much. He found the only piece of unshocked olivine ever discovered on the moon. And if you were a geologist, you'd be freaking out. Really what that rock says is there were volcanic eruptions on the moon. Because the only way you make a piece of unshocked olivine is that it get compressed inside of the moon and then it got shot out onto the surface. The real problem with the Apollo missions was this lunar lander. It had a set of failure modes in it that were unrecoverable. And if anything happened to that lander, there was no way to rescue the astronauts. It takes 3 days to launch a rescue mission, and there was only 3 days worth of supplies. We couldn't get to them. And so they had to stop. It was too dangerous. It wasn't worth it. And what's happened since then is we've improved the technology to the point where we can have survivable modes of being on the moon. So the Artemis mission is really about exercising all of those pieces now to do what I originally did that moon base talk about. Can we put bases on the moon to allow scientists to work over an extended period of time to get value from the moon? So we've had our first mission. This was an unmanned mission that really exercised the system. It actually demonstrated a lot of orbital mechanics that we've only ever modeled but never flown. So you may have watched the Artemis 1 mission. It had lots of cameras and things on it. It did a lot of interesting maneuvers. But it was the physical tests of theoretical behavior with orbital mechanics to do really fuel-efficient maneuvering. And they proved most of it, that our models are bang on. We know more, we have better computers and better technology now to do precise orbital maneuvers than we've ever had in history. And Artemis 1 tested a lot of it. The next Artemis mission is supposed to fly in November of 2024. The crew's been picked, 3 Americans, 1 Canadian. And they're going to go around the moon. They're not going to do any fancy orbital mechanics for this. They're going to do what's called a free return trajectory. So they're not even going to go into orbit around the moon. They're going to go out there, and then they're going to come back. So very much the Apollo 8 experience from back in 1967. But it's testing a new spacecraft with a new crew, with new techniques. It's the next step. The third flight, Artemis 3, is supposed to land on the moon. And this is where we get back to our friend Elon. We need a lander. And he's proposed Starship. Now, he proposed it at an incredibly low price because he's already developing it, so he didn't need near as much money as the other proposals. But it is 50 meters tall. Like, I hope you find a flat spot. And the bottom 2/3 of this are tanks. So where you see the solar panels around the upper part, that's where the people go. Watch that first step. You're going to need an elevator. But it should be able to lift 100 tons to the moon, which is a lot of capacity. You're talking big crews, big supplies. They put a set of boosters high up on the lander itself, so that when it lands, it's not going to use the engines on the bottom that'll blow big craters in the ground, but rather be able to land fairly gently. It's an extraordinary idea. I don't think you need anything quite that tall, but it's fully reusable. It has a lot of room to expand. It's got a ton of potential. The challenge, of course, is you have to refuel it. So you're going to put the lander up into orbit first, and then you're going to fly several tankers to it and fill it up with fuel, and then fly the crew on Orion, get out to the moon. They transfer onto the lander from there, land on the moon, come back up, and then they can take Orion back home because it has the heat shield that allow it to re-enter back to the Earth. And presumably you're going to leave that lander in orbit and refuel it up there, or maybe take it to the Lunar Gateway. Like, nobody talks about what the next mission is going to look like for this, but that's going to be part of the problem. Could they possibly fly the lander back into low Earth orbit, refuel it there? Good questions. We've never put anything back into orbit having come from the moon. You know, we forget about the gravity effects. When you initially leave the moon, you're moving very slowly. You give it just a little bit of a nudge to get enough thrust to get away from the moon and be out of its sphere of influence. And then you start falling towards the Earth, and you keep accelerating and accelerating, accelerating. By the time you get to the moon, by the time you get back to the Earth, you're moving. You're doing 25 kilometers a second, right? And that's why the Orion has this massive heat shield on it, that it actually slows down by bouncing off the atmosphere and coming back out of the atmosphere again, and then going back into it to slow you down enough to actually get back to the surface without being fried to a crisp. The bigger the machine, the more difficult that is to do. The amount of fuel it would take to decelerate to get back into orbit, very challenging. And if you mess it up, you're just going to be slung away from the Earth, and you'll be back in a few months. Hope you brought some extra sandwiches. It's not the only lunar lander proposed. Blue Origin and a crew of others are proposing this lander, where the fuel tanks are above and the people are below, which is kind of smart. So you can sort of be at walkout height, just have a ladder, don't need an elevator. They're proposing using liquid hydrogen. That means they need to be able to store liquid hydrogen on the lander, something that's never been done before. Liquid hydrogen is such a volatile fuel. It has such a narrow temperature range in which it remains liquid. It means they need to do regenerative cooling. They've got to deal with pressurization. It's going to be very hard to retain that fuel. Like, that is an unsolved problem. And you want to have 2 weeks up there on the surface, and you're going to store that fuel while you're doing it. Boy, a great problem to work on. If you solve it, it's awesome, but it is not solved. There's also this whole thing about refueling. We casually talk about refueling. Ask me how much refueling we've done in space. None. Why? Because it's hard. This whole free fall thing kind of messes stuff up. Let me show you a video. This is a fuel tank in space. It's currently accelerating. It's in motion, getting into orbit. Tell me if you can notice when it gets to orbit. Now, is my clock actually running on this? There we go. Under thrust, under thrust, under thrust. Oop, not anymore. Whee! Why is this a problem? Well, how are you going to suck the fuel out of the tank if it's not down at the bottom of the tank? It's just floating around inside the chamber. Like, that's not a simple problem to solve. The answer, of course, is to use acceleration. Now, we have rockets relight all the time. The upper stage of the Falcon 9, you typically do several firings to complete a positioning on an orbit, especially for geostationary orbit. And so they use little ullage thrusters. They actually just spray a little fuel out the back under pressure, and that's enough to shift the rocket a little bit to have the fuel settle to the bottom of the tank. And once you've done that, then you can fire the engine. You have lots of thrust, and off you go. So when we start thinking about refueling, especially over a period of time, we've got to get the fuel to settle in the tanks. So this was one of the early proposals for a Starship tanker and a Starship going to the Mars, where they connect together bottom to bottom. Now that kind of makes sense. It's where all the fuel lines run anyway. And you really only need the one that's pumping out to have its fuel settle to the line. So this would be the tanker on the backside. So it should be pushing to settle its tanks and then pump the fuel out. Now, what's that do to the orbit the whole time you're doing it? Either raising it or lowering it. I'd recommend raising it. Lowering it involves contact with atmosphere and consequences, because these refuelings are going to take a while. But the whole time, you're going to be shifting your position in orbit while you're doing it. So you need to have some kind of ullage thruster to manage that. By the way, this is not a new problem. The United Launch Alliance folks back in 2011 proposed the upper stage for the Artemis to be a refueling tank. So they talked about sun shields and tanks and transfer interfaces. So, I mean, this problem's been studied for a while. It's hard to deal with, doubly so if you include liquid hydrogen in the mix. Liquid methane, because it goes through the same cooling systems as liquid oxygen, has very mature storage mechanisms. It also has very mature regenerative cooling mechanisms. So we have much better grasp on how to maintain liquid oxygen and liquid methane at cryogenic temperatures over an extended period of time. It's one of the reasons to use that fuel. Another proposed design, and this is just a mock-up, but boy, it'd be cool to build something round. But imagine all of these ships docking in on the central frame when it's not moving, and then when you need to pump fuel, you just give it a little bit of a spin. And that's enough to settle all the fuel in the tanks, and you can pump things around. So you'd be typically doing this in pairs, perhaps more, but you don't shift the orbits near as much. It creates a couple of Coriolis effects. There's going to be some fun twisting of things. Spinning stuff in space is way more complicated than we think about, but feasible. This is kind of known technology that we can make work. And all of this to refuel that lander and other potential ships for us to do more extended explorations of the moon. And let's talk a bit about what's been going on the moon, because NASA's been working hard on it. This particular mock-up drawing is the old Blue Origin proposal, which they called the National Mission. The important part of this picture is not that lander. The important part is the guy in the foreground, or woman, I don't know, can't see the face, didn't flip up the visor. It's not Jack Schmidt. The important part is that they're kneeling, because you can't kneel. All those Apollo suits, because they're inflated with oxygen to keep you alive, make it too stiff for you to bend your knees meaningfully. If you ever watched the folks that were on the moon, they kind of do one of these. They're hopping, because bending your legs is incredibly hard. And so what they're proposing in this photo is that we've got pressure solutions good enough to actually let you kneel down. They've been developing this suit for many years. One of the goals of the suit is that it has an 800-hour lifespan. The longest they ever kept a suit on the moon that was functional, 22 hours. We used it over 3 days. So now they want to get 800 hours out of a suit. The regolith on the surface of the moon is this incredibly abrasive, fine talc. Apparently it smells like gunpowder. It's very dangerous to breathe. The Apollo astronauts all had issues from breathing that stuff that they walked around on because they took their suits off as they were inside the lunar module to sleep. There's a lot of conversation about how we're going to deal with that. One of the best ideas I've heard is an electrostatic filter that they're actually going to put mesh into the suit, and you're going to pulse electricity through it, and it will push all the dust off. Very scientific, right? Like mere magic kind of thing. But all the problems they have to deal with to function on the moon. I've also seen designs where this pack actually bolts onto the spacecraft, and then it pops open through the back, and the person climbs out of the suit from the mounted on the back, so the suit never comes into the spacecraft anymore. It stays outside, and you keep the dust outside. All problems we're trying to solve. The goal is the South Pole. Why the South Pole? Because this is actually one of the Blue Origin proposals for a landing site on the southern rim of the Shackleton crater. The Shackleton crater is almost directly onto the South Pole. What makes it cool is that it's in a continuously shaded area, plus the crater rims almost have continuous sunshine, a side effect of being right on the South Pole. In fact, there's this video clip. That is the Shackleton crater. The question you should be asking is, who took this picture? This is not a simulation, it's a composition. This is the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, and every time it flew directly over the Shackleton crater, it took a picture, and they composited together over a lunar year to show how parts of the rim of the crater always have sunshine on them, so a great place to put your solar panels, and the interior of the crater, which can hold eight Copenhagens. That's a big crater. Never get sunshine. There are billions of tons of ice at the bottom of that crater, and that's the asset we're after, is to extract water ice from the moon. We've never used resources outside of the Earth for space exploration. We're like the folks that load up an RV with everything they need and never go to 7-Eleven the whole trip. every bit of water, every roll of toilet paper, everything's in the RV. That's how you do space flight right now. And the proposal is to get past that. Can we start using resources that are up there? And water ice is a big one. You can drink it, you can break it down into hydrogen and oxygen and breathe part of it. In theory, you can make it into rocket fuel, but I'm not a big fan of hydrolox fuels. Most people that know their way around rocketry come to that conclusion pretty quickly. But it's a real resource, and water's everywhere in space. We should get good at using water in space. That's a lot of weight you can eliminate. Stop lifting it off the Earth, start utilizing it where it is. And this is an awesome place to begin that exploration. The other challenge we have on the moon is the gravity is very irregular. We have now mapped the gravity wells of the moon. If you're into the Apollo missions and you listen to Apollo 11 as it went in for a landing, it's famous, that whole famous story of Neil taking manual control of the lander to get away from some boulders and land in a different area. Like, why was that ever necessary? Well, the landing site they picked was nice and flat and safe. They just missed it. Why did they miss it? Because the gravity on the moon is not even. And they didn't know that in the 1960s. There are mass concentrations on the surface of the moon that vary the gravity by a couple of percentage points. Now, they figured it out pretty quickly. If you listen to the whole half hour from when they separate from Eagle and begin the burn to land, within a few minutes, you can hear Neil say, "We're long." They had mapped the path of the landing with all of the major landmarks so precisely they knew when they should pass each one, and they were passing them too soon. And the reason was there was more gravity than expected. They had the average gravity. They didn't have the gravity along the path they were flying. And so the vehicle got accelerated a bit, and they flew farther than expected. And so he missed his landing site and ended up in an area with house-sized boulders, just the kind that will wreck your lunar lander. And he took manual control, and with a few seconds of excess fuel available to him, landed in a safe area and survived. Now we have the map. We can plan better how to land more precisely. It's part of the challenge of being effective in the moon. We got this together a few years ago. One of the ESA proposals is to actually put up an array of satellites around the moon, both for communication and for navigation. So think something similar to a GPS, but far fewer satellites, and they have a different kind of orbital structure. Because of the irregularities of the moon, it's very hard to orbit low around the moon. But you can do these eccentric orbits, and they're pretty stable. And so you do a set of satellites flying in an eccentric orbit, and that way you can always triangulate your exact position, and you should always be in communications. The Chinese had to overcome this when they put their lunar down on the far side of the moon. The first time we've ever landed anything soft on the far side of the moon was back in 2017 with the Chang'e 4 lander. And again, who took this picture? The lander took this picture of the U-2 rover, known as the Little Rabbit. But in order to communicate with this lander, because it was on the far side of the moon, several months before, the Chinese launched a communication satellite that sits in an orbit above the far side of the moon to be able to relay communications between their rover and back to the Earth. So it makes sense, if we're going to build up a little infrastructure, for us to have a set of those satellites that allow us to navigate and communicate, know where we are, and cope with those particular issues. And I'd be remiss not to celebrate India, the ISRO, just these past few days successfully soft landed on the moon, much the way the Russians didn't. And their little rover is now on the surface of the moon. Lifespan's only a few days. It won't survive a lunar winter, a lunar night. So the day-night cycle on the moon is 14 days of light and 14 days of darkness. And that's a very cold dark. You need a lot of heaters, keep your batteries healthy through that time span, which makes your machine much heavier. And so for these very simple landers, they don't have an ability to survive that night. So it's only going to be running for a couple of weeks, then the night will set in and it will fail. But it's been on the surface of the moon a few days. They're only the fourth country to ever soft land something on the moon, after the US, the Soviet Union, and China. And now we have the Indians up there. The Russians have never landed anything successfully on the moon, making a distinction between Russia and the Soviet Union. Could we build a base on the moon? Well, this is what Elon thought we'd built. That's his rocket. I look at this and I think, Burning Man. Or remember Space 1999? Kind of looks like Space 1999. But a realistic base is not going to be that sexy. Have you ever seen pictures of the Antarctic bases that you don't think, Burning Man? You think, boy, that's a box. The ESA proposal was to take an airlock with an inflatable habitat on it, land it softly, inflate it automatically, and then use robots to bury it under a meter of regolith for radiation protection, so that you have a safe place that you can be on to operate on the moon for some period of time. Another proposal is to use skylights, or the lava tubes on the moon. We know that there's been volcanic activity on the moon, and the side effect of this is as the lava flowed, as it drained away again, it left behind these huge tunnels. And the skylights are where the tunnels were so close to the surface that it's collapsed. This is the Marius skylight. That's almost a kilometer across that hole. It's big, and it's 80 meters down. And then we don't know how far the tube goes. The Japanese are proposing to put a lander down that hole and start to get a map of what's down there. We can imagine, if we get a good shape around this, that we could put an inflatable habitat into the lava tube and get our radiation shielding essentially for free, and build a better habitat. And go farther down the Dr. No path, where we're sort of coming out of the moon. But it's an interesting approach to it, and a little more practical. The question is, are there skylights in the places we want to be? Because we want to be on the poles. All of the Apollo landings were very much close to the equator of the moon, just from the limitations of the technology at the time. They always landed on the near side of the moon, so that they had communications with the Earth, and they landed in a relatively narrow range of latitudes. And now we're finding that the interesting bits of the moon are much closer to the poles. And so we need to find those sites. If there's questions about why to do any of this, the research part, I hope's enough. Just the fact that when you let scientists loose in a new environment, it's cool. That becoming a spacefaring race is a practical goal. We have to get beyond this bed at some point. But also that we should protect ourselves. That learning to develop these technologies gives us the ability to do what the dinosaurs couldn't do, which was manage asteroids. In fact, we had our first dedicated asteroid mission just a couple of years ago, the DART mission, that flew up and impacted on an asteroid to see if we could change its behavior. And we can. So if you haven't followed this particular story, this was a binary set of asteroids. So this particular asteroid, Didymos, moves fairly close to the Earth in an orbit outside of Earth, and it has a smaller moon we call the Didymoon, or it's actually Dimorphos, but Didymoon's funnier, that was orbiting it. And so the DART impactor hit the smaller moon to slow it down. Their goal was to decrease the orbit on it just a little bit. Something they were able to measure it. It was something practical they could do. They sent cameras along with it. There's actually a set of Italian microbots that followed behind the impactor. So you can see Dimorphos on the upside, and this is a sped up version of this. This is actually from the DART lander itself, as it's going to come in and impact on the moon. It takes a few seconds for it to get there, but this is summarizing the last 5 minutes of DART. So Didymos, the bigger one, 780 meters across. The Dimorphos is 160 meters across, and here comes. Didn't quite finish that last frame. Notice it looks like a rubble pile. That's the last frame. So it was transmitting that right up until the transmitter turned into vapor as it impacted at 6.6 kilometers a second with vigor. We had a telescope watching it, so you can see the spray coming from Dimorphos. It actually changed Dimorphos' orbit by 33 minutes. They had tried to reduce it they thought they could get 77 seconds out of it, they'd be kicking ass. They got a 33-minute decrease in that. And that's because the ejecta created a lot more momentum. So now it has about 1,000 metric tons of debris following in a trail 30,000 kilometers long behind Dimorphos from that impact. We're not helpless in the face of planetary defense. We have demonstrated a tool that could potentially protect our planet from a catastrophic collision, given enough time and effort. We did a test. The test worked. We're building a new tool to protect ourselves. The more we map out those asteroids, the better we understand it, the sooner we can see it, the more options we have to deal with it. We're dealing with orbital debris with the International Space Station. Now, the space station's getting old. The first parts flew in '98. It's been continuously inhabited since 2000. They hope to keep it going until 2025. Now they're saying 2030. The Russians are being difficult. They might want to separate on their own. But the reality is that there are parts on the space station that are wearing out, and they are spending more time dodging orbital debris, it seems, lately. And eventually they're going to have to deorbit it. And everyone's okay with that because NASA's doing another commercial spaceflight system. They're saying, hey, give us your proposals for commercial space stations. We're not going to buy your station and tell you how to build it. We're going to tell you what we want to do in orbit, and if you can provide that, here's what we're willing to pay. And a bunch of companies have come forward with proposals to build new space stations. We've kind of got used to there only being one. Although, to be clear, there is two, right? The Chinese are flying a manned space station now, the Tianhe, that's had 3 people aboard it for the past year. They've actually rotated crews now. So they have a very functional, if somewhat dated style of space station compared to the International Space Station. But the International Space Station is a design from the 80s, flown in the 2000s, and now it's 2020 and pieces are wearing out. That's the Tiangong Space Station. It's actually a mock-up picture, not a real picture. We don't have good pictures of it. There's another module coming for the space station. It's very much like Mir, if you're old enough to remember the old Russian, Soviet space station. Here are the current proposals for next-generation space stations. Possibly all of these will be built if they're sufficiently funded. So these are, one of the advantages here is to do different space stations for different kinds of tasks. Optimizing a space station for free-fall manufactory, optimizing it for experiments in rotational dynamics, in artificial gravity effects. So a bunch of different companies here. Many of them will be familiar as American technology companies. Blue Origin's, of course, in there with their orbital reef. The Axiom space guys, to me, in a lot of ways, are the most interesting ones for a couple of reasons. One is most of the team, ex-space station folks from NASA. They are already flying payloads to the space station today in the form of billionaire tourists. They've bought 2 Crew Dragons to fly 4 folks up onto the space station for about a week. Rough costs, somewhere in $160 million per flight, so 40 mil each, save up. But at least it's payloads, and they are now building a module to add to the International Space Station with the goal to make their own space station there, the Axiom Space one. The orbital reef, this is Blue Origin's proposal. That's a 7-meter in diameter space station module, as opposed to the 4-meter ones that are on the the current space station made. 7 meters, a lot more volume. It's also big enough that you can't touch the sides. And if you're in free fall and can't touch the sides, you're stuck there. There's really no way to get out of that. They demonstrate this occasionally on the space station. If I position you just right so that you can't reach anything, you can't get out of it. Like, it isn't going to work. And so one of the things they're saying when you get these bigger spaces is you have to break them up into smaller chambers so that you can always reach a surface. You're in free fall, or you can get stranded inside of the space station. This is actually giant. It would be at least 3 primary modules, a bunch of expansions, so it won't be that big initially, given New Glenn flies at all. One of the coolest bits of the orbital reef proposal was this little vehicle from Genesis Engineering. So it's almost like a submersible. It's a single-person vehicle that you can climb into at pressure, separate from the station, and then go and do work on the station. Right now, if you want to go do work on the station, on the International Space Station, they do use these suits. And the problem is that in order for you to be able to move in this suit, it's at a much lower pressure so that you can actually flex your fingers and be able to move around. And that means you spend about 3 hours pre-breathing oxygen to be able to be healthy in that low-pressure environment inside of that suit, which means there's no quick actions for getting out into a spacewalk. It takes 2 people to put the suit on an individual and 3 hours of pre-breathing to get you rigged up to go out. So having a little vehicle like this that you could quickly go out and do some maintenance could really change things for a lot of folks. The NanoRacks design is a single inflatable module. It's mostly remote tended, so that you can see those little free-flying modules around it. They're supposed to be able to do maintenance and work on it. That's an interesting concept. but they're designed to have lots of small stations. And that Axiom space module, these are the ones they're adding to the space station. They have permission to do this. The first module is under construction now, so this may actually be real. We'll see, in some ways I don't believe it till it flies, but their goal is to build 4 modules, and at the point where they have 4 modules, they should be able to separate from the space station and continue to function after the space station has to be retired. It's the oldest modules on the International Space Station that are starting to crack and wear out, and they also happen to have the life support systems and other important bits that are just not easy to replace. I recently read a proposal that Discovery, which is the module it is attached to, might go with it because it's still got another 10 years of life. So maybe Axiom will take over a piece of the space station along with its own mission to do some additional work. So there's new life for space stations and new sort of designs. And all of the elements that are in here tie to the other goals you might think of to become a spacefaring species. How do we mine asteroids? Well, look at the components here, even in this mock-up. They're very much like space station modules. We know how to fly intercept orbits. We know how to do that kind of maneuvering. We can learn how to mine and refine on the moon and apply that to asteroids. So bit by bit, all of those skills come together. If you're wondering the stuff that we're working on right now, it is with an eye to these kinds of future capabilities. So nothing is flags and footprints here. It's not one and done. It is about building up skill sets that extend to the next steps. If you like talks like this, these are the Geek Outs. There's about 100 of them on the .NET Rocks site, or I have a shortcut for you, geekout.show. If you go there, it'll take you to .NET Rocks, and you can look it up, all the Geek Outs there. Some of them are getting old. There's lots of alternative energy and low emission stuff. I did one on whiskey and and antibiotics, a bunch of other topics, and many, many, many space shows. Annually now, I do a space and energy updates, typically towards the end of the year if you want to listen to it. Hope that was fun for you. Thanks so much for staying. Have a great conference.